Hello and welcome to Early Childhood Ireland's podcast, which features interviews and discussions on all issues relating to high quality in the early years and school age care sector. In our episodes, we've a range of speakers who are leaders in the areas that matter to Early Childhood Ireland members. This podcast series is proudly supported by Aricus Insurance, which offers a comprehensive range of cover at discounted premiums for both business and personal insurance products. So pop over and visit www.aricus.ie for more information. I'm Maura Corbett and I work with Early Childhood Ireland. In a number of episodes recently of our podcast, we've examined aspects of the updated Aistear, which is starting to be implemented and rolled out in settings all around the country from this September. As the redevelopment, the update of the Aistear framework has implications for the Aistear Síolta practice guide, I'm really delighted today to be joined by Lorraine Farrell from NCCA to tell us about these changes to the practice guide, and she'll signpost us to the resources that are available to support educators to familiarise themselves with some of the key changes and to reflect on how the practice guide can support change and reflection and so on in practice. Lorraine has worked in early childhood for over 25 years in a variety of areas, including practice, management, training, mentoring, lecturing, researching and policy development, along with which she has owned her own sessional setting. Her love of early years started with transition year work experience in a small rural Montessori school, and she went on to do a BA in ECCE in DIT, an MA in Leadership and Advocacy in ECCE in Sligo, and she's currently undertaking a doctorate in Maynooth University. She's worked in NCCA since 2018, and she currently holds the position of National Aistear Development Officer. She was involved in the update of Aistear and has responsibility for, among other things, the Aistear Síolta Practice Guide. So, as I say, as we move into the implementation of Aistear, her work is central to the National Aistear Síolta Initiative. And through this initiative, Lorraine works closely with support services such as Better Start, the City and County Childcare Committees, and that's so important to ensure consistent national messaging in the rollout. So, Lorraine, you're really welcome. I'm looking forward to hearing about some of the key aspects of the update to the practice guide.
Thanks a million, Maura. I'm delighted to be here.
So, can you remind our listeners about some of the background and origins of the Aistear Síolta Practice Guide? And I suppose when we were chatting before this, I was kind of saying full disclosure. I was seconded from Early Childhood Ireland back in 2014 on the initial drafts and iterations of the Aistear Síolta Practice Guide, and it's just so lovely to see that it has continued to grow, develop with new resources and so on over the years. So I'm delighted to hear about, how it has come from 2014, 15 when it was initially launched to now. So
Yeah,
you're going to tell us about some of those origins.
I will for sure. Yeah. So I suppose, first of all, just to say what the practice guide is, and most of your listeners will probably know, but it's an online resource specific to the Irish context, to bring our two early childhood frameworks together in practice, Aistear and Síolta. And it's there to support early years educators, I suppose, to develop their quality of their practice, ultimately with the view to create better learning experiences for babies, toddlers, and young children. But I suppose, yes, you're right. We do need to take a step back for a minute and think about where the practice guide came from. So actually, I think it was October 2013, the Department of Education and Science, as it was, Education and Skills, as it was, asked the NCCA to develop a resource that would help early years educators to bring those two national frameworks together in their practice. Um, and I suppose while both frameworks are distinct in their own right, it was felt that early years educators needed support to be able to use them side by side in practice to support the quality of the practice with babies, toddlers, and young children, as I said. And what's really important to note is the practice guide is a support tool, but it doesn't replace Síolta or Aistear. It draws on both of them and brings them together. And as you just said, Maura, you were involved. You joined the NCCA team in 2014, and that's when work really started on developing the practice guide. It was published in 2015, but I suppose work on it started in 2014, and very much, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but my sense is the aim of the practice guide was really to create this central hub for early years educators as a space where they could go, I suppose, to get support on implementing the two frameworks together in their practice. And there was a dedicated development team of which you were a part. But it's really important to note, though, that the practice guide was developed with input from lots of stakeholders. And while the development team were there, I suppose, to bring it to fruition, there was a huge amount of consultation and input
Huge.
from across the early years sector. And you might remember more, but as far as I know, there was early years educators, there was Síolta coordinators, there was Better Start specialists, there was development officers from the city and county childcare committees, there was the MVCOs, there was academics, researchers, and
Yeah.
there was a huge amount of collaboration, I think, around what the practice guide should be, what it should look like, what should it hold. And I think the main aim was that it was grounded in real life Irish practice, that it was relevant to those who were coming to use it. Would you agree with
Yeah,
that? Yeah.
absolutely. And I suppose one of the things was that, at that time, my colleagues and I in Early Childhood Ireland, we'd have been doing the Síolta QAP, and prior to that, Centre of Excellence and so on, other NVCOs were working on the QAP as well. Or even if we went to settings on a mentoring visit or whatever, and, you'd see settings because while the Aistear and Síolta were developed at broadly similar times,
Yeah.
and there was a degree of collaboration between the CECDE and the NCCA, they were still viewed as separate documents, and there was
Yeah.
very little support around their implementation together. So when we go into settings, and and as a setting manager, you were possibly in this position too. People had their Síolta folder, they had their Aistear folder, they had their Tusla folder, and maybe they had, some other folder, instead of, being supported to see that these were all systems that should and could work kind of in tandem. And I think the practice guide was being developed simultaneously with the setup of Better Start. The secondment was for 6 months, and eventually it became 17 months
Mm-hmm.
because there was a lot of scoping to be done. It built on previous initiatives such as Aistear in Action that Early Childhood Ireland and NCCA had done together with
Mm-hmm.
seven settings in North Cork and South Tip. But, even the scoping of the relevant Síolta standards to the practice guide, because not everything from Síolta is relevant to the practice guide. So there was a very big scoping exercise there that I remember being involved in. And I think that was really good because it meant Better Start. The Better Start mentors were very familiar with it from the early days because, like you say, they were consulted on the content. And it subsequently went on to form the basis for the Department of Education early years focused inspections. And that kind of, I suppose, collaboration helped to ensure its success, I think.
Yeah, and I think along with all of that, one of the strengths of it is that it is available online, and so it can be used in such a variety of ways. With the National Shield Asher initiative mentors in Better Start or in the city and county childcare committees, but also it can be used by early years educators and settings independently if they so wish. So whether somebody's working alone, working alongside colleagues in their room, in their setting with the mentor. The practice guide is there, I suppose, to support that ongoing reflection and development and improvement of practice, And I suppose at its core, it was built on the idea of reflective professional practice, taking that time to notice, to think about, to act on what you see happening in your setting. And I think that's probably one of the most powerful ways to improve quality within your setting. And as you said, I had my own setting for many years, and I certainly come from living that experience. That reflective practice is what improved the quality of my practice when I was working with babies, toddlers, and young children. And I suppose when we're talking about using it in practice and the function of it, I think it's important to remember that all the resources on the practice guide, and we'll talk about them in more detail in a little while, but I think it's really important to remember that the practice guide is designed on the assumption or the basis that the basics are already in place. So things like the requirements to adhere to the Childcare Act, the regulations, health and safety, child protection, there's an assumption made that they're all in place, that is the fundamental foundation of practice. And then the practice guide and the resources on it then act as the tool, I suppose, to develop your thinking and your reflection on your current practice.
Yeah, it's not, and that was always the case, that there were assumptions made around basic compliance. And
Yeah,
I suppose
exactly.
it's also important to say that the earlier editions of the practice, and I hesitate to say editions because it's online, so it's evolving all the time,
Iterations,
but
maybe.
iterations. Verse
Mm.
5 came after, so that would have resulted in it being further evolved as verse 5 came along.
Yeah, I think you're 100% right there. And I suppose we've just said that the practice guide, it was published in 2015, so 10 years ago now. And the early years sector has gone through huge change in that 10 years. And like, I won't list all the changes. Our listeners don't need us to list them. They have lived through them. But I do think it might be worth pausing on some of them, though, just to reflect on those big shifts, but also to think about then where the practice guide fits within that policy context. So, like, if you think about the ECC
And to
program.
say as well that sorry, now before you move on, to
No,
say
you're
as well
fine.
that it's those shifts over since the original Aistear was launched in '09. That's what led to the updating of Aistear. So the same triggers that caused Aistear to be updated naturally led to the
A
updating of
hundred
the
percent,
practice guide.
absolutely. And as you say, Aistear was originally published in 2009, September 2009, I believe. And then January 2010, only a few months later, the ECCE program was announced. So there was a major policy change within a couple of months of Aistear being originally published. And like that ECC program was a huge milestone. But I suppose interestingly, the terms and conditions of engaging with the ECC program from the very start for early years educators was they had to adhere to the principles of Aistear and Síolta, which was really important as they considered the curriculum they were going to develop for the young children in attendance. So the practice guide was, that was a catalyst for the practice guide as well to have that space to support educators to do it in practice. Um, and I suppose you've just mentioned there, Maura, as the practice guide was being developed, Better Start, the National Early Years Quality Support Service, that was also in development in 2014, I think. And I suppose the practice guide really became the key focal point, the support for the Better Start mentors, and that's still the case. But I suppose it's not only with Better Start; it has also, been used to support lots of other state-funded initiatives, with yourselves and Early Childhood Ireland, the MVCOs, and so on. And then if you think about inspections, we talked about the preschool regulations there a minute ago, but the Department of Education inspections came on board around that time as well. I think it was 2015 when the Department of Children and Youth Affairs, as they were, contacted the Department of Education Inspectorate and asked them to roll out early years education focused inspections. And while those inspections have their own framework, they're very much rooted in Aistear and Síolta. And inspectors often point earlier services to the practice guide as a way of strengthening, their
Yeah.
practice, whether it's around planning or whatever it
Yeah.
might
No,
be,
that framework is very much linked to the practice guide.
A
So,
hundred percent,
that,
yeah, and so too is Tusla's QRF, and
mm,
you can see the influence of Síolta and Aistear on the QRF, and the practice guide is mentioned in it. And then, as you say, we had First Five. I think that was 2018. That talks about the vital connections of Síolta and Aistear together in practice as well. And in 2016, the National Síolta Aistear Initiative was set up, and that was really about the coordinated rollout of Síolta and Aistear in practice. And it brought together so many players, I suppose, in the policy space, the Department of Education, the Department of Children, the NCCA, the MVCOs, the CCCs, Better Start, and it's really that collaborative space where we're ensuring that nationally consistent messaging around Aistear and Síolta and the practice guide. The NSAI is playing a big part in that, around that nationally consistent messaging, through the practice guide, but through other mechanisms as well, like continuous professional development, CPD, training, mentoring. And at the moment, the CCCs are delivering workshops on the principles and themes of Aistear as part of the initial part of the rollout of the updated Aistear. That's all coming in under the National Síolta Aistear Initiative. So I suppose the point I'm making when I talk about all of this is the practice guide isn't a standalone
no.
resource. It's
Mm.
right there at the centre of the national quality agenda, kind of supporting and guiding practice with early years educators.
So can you take us through, and you've brought us neatly around to key changes in the practice guide in light of all the policy changes, most particularly the update of Aistear last year.
Yeah, I suppose as soon as Aistear was updated, we moved into the space of updating the supports to go with it. So the practice guide has been through an updating process, and I suppose that updating process, it wasn't just about tweaking some of the wording or adding some new resources. It was really about bringing Aistear's vision to life in practice. And I suppose I think one of the strengths of how it's been done is that it wasn't a top-down approach developed kind of in isolation. It very much mirrored the approach that your working group would have taken back in 2014. It was collaborative, it was consultative. So a working group was established, and I won't get into too much boring detail on this, but a working group was established with representatives from the NSAI, the National Síolta Aistear Initiative, and the National Support Services. But the work that group did in auditing the resources and updating them was taken to the early years sector for review. So a number of early years educators were right at the heart of that review process, the quality assurance process. So what they did for us was they checked that the materials were relevant, that they were practical, and that they actually reflect what happens in settings, but also what they need to support their staff and the children they work with in settings. And that was really important because the entire aim of the practice guide is to give early years educators the tools to interpret Aistear, reflect on and strengthen their practice, Um, so it was really important to us that early years educators were at the center of that, and like the updated Aistear sees early years educators as agentic, reflective, competent, and confident. And that is very much mirrored in the practice guide. It really recognizes educators as those confident, reflective professionals, and really values the fact that early years educators on a daily basis, down to an hourly basis, they have to draw on their professional knowledge, their professional relationships, and their professional judgment in thinking about what's going well and what might need to change. And that's where the update of the practice guide is grounded to support them to do that. And I suppose another important point of the update is the practice guide has moved house. It is
Okay.
now situated on the Nurturing Skills website. So it's no longer sitting on its own, but it's part of that bigger system of professional learning and development. And I think the move is an important one. I think it makes it easier for early years educators to find all of the connected resources in one place, and but also to see how Aistear and Síolta and the practice guide fit into that wider national policy, and not like, as you said earlier on, where we have our Síolta folder, our Aistear folder,
Mm.
do you know, but it's all in that one space, you know. And I suppose while the update is complete, so what I hope educators find when they go to it is something that's familiar but fresh, you know, and
Mm.
that they still
Mm.
see that it's a living resource, and it's there for everyone to explore. But there's lots more coming. You know, we have completed the update and now we're moving into the development phase
The
again.
development, yeah. I
Yeah.
think another good thing I think about, the new home, if you like, and it comes back to something we've spoken about on the podcast. We did a podcast with Dr. Aaron Bradbury. You might have heard it, for
I
the
did.
International Day of Play,
Yes.
and he spoke about, some of the challenges they have about in the UK about justifying play and, making the value of play visible to policymakers and so on. And I wrote a blog about it afterwards, actually, that we're actually, there's a lot to do here, but we're very lucky that play is valued, in our government policy, particularly for early years, and having the practice guide situated on, the Department Nurturing Skills website, I think kind of says something about the value that as a society we put on play and, a play-based pedagogy for our youngest citizens, which is really
Yeah.
good too.
Yeah, I think so. I agree. I think it
Yeah,
gives a very powerful message.
good message. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So you were saying about, finding something fresh but familiar. So what's the same and what's changed? Are the foundations and pillars still there, or have they changed? Or, can you take us through some of those, structural developments, we'll say?
I will, yeah, for sure. So I suppose the updated practice guide, it keeps that same overall structure as the original, but there are a few important changes. So, um, the curriculum foundations are still there, and the 6 interconnected pillars of practice are still there. But the titles of the pillars of practice have been updated slightly. They're still very familiar, but they've been updated slightly to reflect the updated Aistear and the guidance for good practice. So the 6 pillars are partnerships and connections, learning environments, learning through play, relationships and interactions, planning and assessing, and supporting transitions. And like the original, each of the pillars are connected and they all go into detail, I suppose, on what quality practice looks like in that individual pillar. So the self-valuation tools are still there, and they have been updated with the updated concepts in Aistear. You'll see lots of reference to slow relational pedagogy, to sustainability, to the rights of the child. Um, and within each of the pillars, so you have the self-valuation tools, but you also have educator guides in there. And those guides, we used to call them tip sheets, but that has been updated to reflect the professional language of the sector. And the guides dive deeper into particular topics. So there are some on um, that were there already that have been updated, and those ones will be familiar to listeners. Developing a rights-based, emergent, and inquiry-based curriculum, the understanding positive learning dispositions, using open-ended materials, understanding schemas, the role of the key person. They've all been updated. But what's really important is there's lots more resources on the way. And I'll talk about how to use them in a little while, but just to give listeners a sense of the topics that are coming, we'll have these resources are in development at the moment, and we will have resources on things like children's rights and agency, the agentic educator, equity and inclusion, family and community engagement. And there's a greater emphasis on the community engagement bit in the update, engaging with the arts. What else have we got coming? More information on what provocations look like and how to, practical strategies on how to bring provocations into your setting, because it's a new concept. The theme of exploring and thinking places a greater emphasis on outdoors. So we have resources coming on outdoors. There's something on what sustainability looks like in early years, because it's a big concept, and what
Huge.
does sustainable practice look like with babies? So there's very practical strategies or resources with strategies coming on that. There's the updated Aistear talks about intergenerational learning. There's a resource on that. What else is there? There's a huge emphasis on voice in the updated Aistear. And, I was working with some of the support services recently, and they said to me, we need resources. We need resources on what voice looks like with babies, toddlers, and young children. So we're listening. We're listening very carefully to what the sector wants, and that's coming. And like one of the big updates to Aistear, as you well know, Maura, was the reflective cycle of planning and assessing.
Mm.
So there's lots of resources coming on that as well. And I suppose the point that I think is really important to make is these resources that are coming, they are grounded in practice. They're being written by educators in practice. It's very much coming from a practice base. And like, we have a huge variety of services across the country. We have sessional, we've NENA, we've full day care, we've rural, we've urban, we've small, we've large. And the idea is that there'll be a wide variety of authors for these resources to reflect that diversity, I suppose, of experiences and approaches. But I suppose that the common thread between them all, I hope, is that they will provide inspiration for educators to adapt some of what they read in the educator guides or see on a video into their own practice. Because the practice guide really recognizes that every setting is unique. Every child is unique. They all bring their own funds of knowledge. They have different, cultural experiences, social experiences, family experiences, and all of those experiences shape who they are. So the idea behind the updated resources is that they will respond, I suppose, they'll be broad enough to respond to all of that and really give the message that there's no one right way to do it, that we have to be adaptable and, interpret Aistear and Síolta to suit the unique context in which we all work,
That contextualizing is vital. I mean, it's a key point that they make in Reggio Emilia all the time, is that you can be inspired by Reggio Emilia, but you can't be in Raheny and be Reggio in the same way as they are in Reggio. You can be
Yes.
inspired by and take the inspiration from it. And, it's exactly the same way, a small rural setting is so different to a bigger urban setting.
Yeah.
And the children have different backgrounds, different lives, different lifestyles, different life experiences, different relationships. The children in the smaller rural areas, you mentioned intergenerational, they may have a very daily ongoing relationship with grandparents,
Mm-hmm.
but children in a more urban area, particularly if parents are from, let's say, rural Ireland, they may not know their grandparents in the same way. So, every context is completely different, and it's so
Completely
important to
different.
reflect
And
that.
I think that's one of the strengths of the updated Aistear, that it says, out in central, it's here to be interpreted by the professional agentic early years educator for their unique context. So what Aistear looks like in my setting this year might look totally different next year. And I suppose that's one of the beauties of the practice guide. I think it's not about getting it done. It's not about taking out the self-evaluation tool for, say, the learning environment and doing it and saying, that's it, now I have learning
I'm
environments
done.
done.
Yeah.
Because you don't. The idea is that we come to the resources and the self-evaluation tools with curiosity, with a reflective, open mindset to
Mm.
see, is what we did last year, is it still benefiting the children that we have
Yeah.
this year, you know?
Mm.
And does it still make sense, what we were doing last year, and why are we doing what we're doing? You know, but I think you need to come to it with that openness, interpretativeness, to get the most,
Yeah.
out of it, and to make sure you're meeting the needs and the wants and the, you know, the desires, I suppose, of the babies, toddlers, young children, and their families,
Mm.
do you know? But not only them, but the early years educators as well
As well.
in the room,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
as the early years educators change, we're all going to interpret Aistear differently. But
Mm.
what's important is that how we're interpreting it is informed by national consistent messaging. And that's where the practice guide, among other resources, is coming in
Mm.
to build that national consistent picture of what it means in
Yeah.
practice.
Yeah. I think one of the key points about the self-evaluation tool too is, that it helps you recognize what you're doing well and what's
Yeah,
working well.
yeah,
Because, sometimes, because we all want to do better, we want to improve. It can sometimes feel, does anybody recognize what I am doing? And I think that's the beauty of kind of self-evaluation tools, is that you can get a buzz from the areas that you feel you're doing very well in. And that if you feel there are areas you're doing very well in, it gives you the potential and the confidence to, identify areas that you can move to, a different column to the ones that they were in, so that
yeah.
you can kind of validate your practice a bit at times as well.
100%. And I think what's really important for early years educators to remember is there's no timeline on this. There's no
Mm.
rush, you know. Engagement with the practice guide can and should really happen at a pace that feels manageable for early years educators, because everyone's context is different. So I would really encourage anyone engaging with the practice guide to take their time to explore areas that they're interested in, to revisit familiar supports like the self-evaluation tool, and then gradually draw on the new content as it's released. I've just given a long list of resources that are coming. They're all very exciting, but we have to be realistic about the pace at which early years educators can engage with them. Do you know,
Yeah.
it is not in any way about downloading everything all at once and
Mm.
working through them in a weekend. It's not. It's about picking areas and weaving the updated concepts in, you know, that's there in Aistear and on the practice guide. It's about weaving that into your everyday work so that it's meaningful for you, but
Yeah.
more importantly, that it's sustainable, you know.
Yeah.
And because the ultimate aim is that the resources are there to support the learning experiences of babies, toddlers, and young children. So we have to do that in a way that is accessible, meaningful, and realistic for early years
Yeah.
educators. So I
Yeah.
encourage them to,
Recognizing the massive demands on
oh,
people's time and energy and so on,
absolutely. And you
which
know,
is
we talk
huge.
a lot in the updated Astra about slow relational pedagogy. And in the guidance for good practice, we talk about um, just as you engage babies, toddlers, and young children in a slow relational pedagogy, you should approach partnership with families with the
Mm.
slow relational pedagogy. I'm now suggesting we do the same thing with the practice guide. We
Yeah.
approach it slowly at a pace that suits us. You know, yes, we're beginning to engage with the updated Astra from this term, but the supports that are coming are going to continue months and years ahead. You know, so it's not a race. This is something that all educators should come to at a pace that suits them. And you know, there's a huge appetite out there for it.
Huge.
You know, but it's I suppose, to reiterate that point, that
Yeah.
use the practice guide at a in a way that and a pace that suits yourself, because there's no right way or wrong way to use the practice guide. You know, every setting, every early years educator will find their own path within it, and it'll depend on their strengths, their interests, their needs, but also what's happening in the setting right
Exactly.
now
Yeah.
with the families, with the babies, the toddlers, the young children. It's meant to be flexible. it has to be flexible. So early years educators should dip into it and out of it when it feels relevant, and come back to it as their practice evolves.
So what are the next steps, Lorraine? I think you've taken us through very, very nicely, how to use it, and at your own pace,
Yeah, and
bite
I
size.
think
But and you mentioned some of the developments that are coming. So can you, before we wrap up, can you take us through some of the next steps and
I will,
the
of course,
evolution?
and I will, for sure. And I suppose just before I do that, I would say I've had some queries about how to record your progress on the practice guide. And I think there's no right way or wrong way to do that either. What I'm hearing from educators are some choose to have a digital folder, some have a physical folder. But I suppose the important thing is that it's used to record your evolution, your practice, the evolution of your practice, and not worry about what that looks like, as long as it reflects your individual context. I think that's the most important thing. So we're on a journey, and the National Síolta Aistear initiative is working hard. The practice guide is part of that initiative, and we're very, very committed to national consistent messaging. So there's lots of resources coming, lots of supports coming over the coming months and years. We're adopting a slow approach, and that's very intentional to reflect the slow relational pedagogy that is front and central in Aistear. But what I would say to early years educators is stay in touch with the City and County Childcare Committees, Better Start, the MVCOs. We'll be communicating all of the NSAI updates through them. So we'll be developing more training, more online workshops, more resources. And like everything we've talked about earlier, or through this podcast, we've talked a lot about each setting being unique, each child. There's a real recognition that each early years educator is unique as well. So there's an ambition, I suppose, to create resources and supports that suits the individual circumstances of early years educators. So some resources will be self-directed online that people can do in their own time. There'll be some face-to-face with the CCCs. There'll be on-site mentoring with Better Start, and there'll be communities of professional practice where educators can meet up and talk about what their interpretation of Aistear looks like, how they're using the resources on the practice guide, and that will all inform our work going forward around what more supports are needed.
And the episodes we've done to date on Aistear have been of the podcast have been among the most popular we've ever had. So we're going to continue to do podcasts and blogs and so on that will be kind of helping to reinforce the messaging and so on as well. So Lorraine,
Super.
thanks for all that. Really, really enjoyed the conversation. It was lovely to kind of go back. You kind of took the wind out of my sails, even though I was saying, yeah, it was launched in 2015. It was, yeah, that was then. And then you said it's 10 years old. I was kind of saying, oh my goodness, how did it get to 10? So,
I know.
Lorraine, thank you so much for taking us through it. And it's great to know that it's continuing. There are more resources coming. And I like that emphasis on it, it isn't going to be a bombardment of new resources, that it's going to be slow and gradual. So, that's really good. It'll kind of keep things fresh and keep, you know, and enable that kind of consistent, sustainable, ongoing development of the sector. So thank
Exactly.
you.
And that's what we hope for. So thanks a million for having me, Maura. It was great to chat.
And thank you for listening to this episode of Early Childhood Ireland's podcast, which is proudly supported by Ericus Insurance. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and spread the word to your friends and colleagues. And don't forget to stay tuned for our next episode.